Hello all together. My name is Martina Sauer. I'm an art historian and philosopher. On my homepage, bildphilosophie.de, also in English, you can find all noteworthy information about me. The occasion for today's lecture is International and Interdisciplinary Conference of the German Society for Semiotics in Chemnitz, Germany, from September 28 to October 2nd, where I am chairing, together with my colleagues, the section Image with 12 speakers. With my panel talk on September 28 to 30, I too am tying in concretely with our common theme, images as agents of cultural transformation processes. The title of the 20-minute talk is Vitality Semiotics, Impulses from the Hamburg Circle around Warburg, Cassirer and Werner for a new method in image and cultural studies. Specifically, my talk is divided into 4 points, in which, firstly, the concept of vitality semiotics is introduced. Secondly, the method is distinguished from forerunners. And thirdly, it is applied to an example. The talk finishes with a conclusion. So, before I explain the methodological procedures of vitality semiotics with an example, the concept on which it is based will be introduced. To point 1, the concept: cultural, anthropological, and cognitive science backgrounds. This concept is based on the assumption that the way we perceive the world is not different from the way we perceive images. The reason is that both are based on the same anthropological premises. Thus, both the perception of the world and the perception of images are bound to the receiving senses. Whatever we encounter is processed through the inherent human process of stimulus reception, be it visual, auditory, tactile, olfactory, gustatory, and/or kinesthetic, which thus includes self-perception in space. According to recent empirical research, all these stimuli are always addressed simultaneously, and the respective information is exchanged transmodally and cross-modally. It is remarkable for us that what we perceive does not become significant only with regard to its recognition or representation value, but is initially received and evaluated as so-called living forms or vital forms. If we take a closer look at the 2 modes of perception from the perspective of cognitive science, it becomes apparent that the former presupposes processes according to which what is perceived is already identified as something. Conceptual linguistic and social cultural differentiating processes of what has been perceived form the basis for this. The second mode of perception mentioned is, as it turns out, the one that immediately precedes the first, for it gets along with naming. It is fundamentally non-discursive. Concretely, it is based on the reception and imagination of everything perceived as living and affective forms. on point 2, the method. To the forerunners, to the new, this is the subject of this point. For the concept of vitality semiotics, both ways of perception are central. They form the basis of the methodological framework. In it, it is assumed that it is the non-discursive living or the vital conception of forms that constitutes both the perception of world and that of images. It is directional for the interpretation of forms, and this in both epistemological and, what must be seen as important here, action-relevant terms. Understood as a semiotically relevant process, we process the formal aspects as vividly affective, non-discursive signs that become relevant both for experiencing, interpreting, and complementary for deciding and thus for action. Against this conceptual background, it is accordingly the formal aspects that are relevant for the methodological approach in terms of image and cultural studies. With the focus on images, two methods are of interest, which are mainly practiced in art historical studies and which are combined here. The first is the so-called formal aesthetics, which builds on first studies in the 19th century by Robert Zimmermann. Important representatives until today are the German-speaking researchers Alois Riegel, Heinrich Wölfling, and further Max Imdahl from Bochum and Gottfried Böhm from Basel. The second method goes back to first approaches at the same time by Friedrich Theodor Fischer, which established itself in the 20th century as the so-called iconological method. Essential for it is the elaboration by Erwin Panofsky. Thus, formal aesthetics already ties in with formally abstract elements of pictorial works, recognizes their living effectiveness, and makes them fruitful not only for aesthetic experience, but meanwhile also for epistemologically relevant interpretations bound to chronicle. The iconological method dispenses with these premises and understands them as elements of aesthetic enjoyment that, as subjective sensations, can have no relevance for objective interpretation. Instead, iconology is oriented towards recognizable aspects and their period-typical modes of representations, as well as towards information on the artists, the commissioners, and the era, in order to work out the historical significance of the works on this basis. The view that images are not only relevant to enjoyment or historical significant in terms of content, but also, just as in the perception of the world, provide impulses for one's own life up to decisions and actions, and against this background are to be understood as agents of cultural transformation processes, has not been a topic in research until now. This gap shall be closed with the concept and method of vitality semiotics. The basis for this is earlier own analysis, the research in the so-called Hamburg Circle of the 1920s around Ebbe in Warburg, Ernst Cassirer, and Heinz Werner. Furthermore, after immigration to the USA, those of Susan K. Langer and John Michael Croix, as well as the more recent empirical research from developmental psychology and the neurosciences. There is currently a close project-related research exchange with the latter by me. Point 3 on the application of the method takes place on the basis of the concrete visual material. The video view of me as a speaker is now hidden until the end of the talk. First, to what we see. 12 photos make up the series Transformer. Here, the blue ones, each consisting of 6 portraits hung side by side in mirror image, which Katharina Sieverding is showing in the current exhibition Museum Frieder Burda in Baden-Baden, Germany, until January 9, 2022. Here in the overview of Figure 1, this is not so recognizable, since a different focus was set by the photographer, whereby at the same time the other photo series, Stauffenberg-Block, here in the background in red, which builds on the same foundations, is also shown. Therefore, I would like to switch now to Figure 2. Remarkable about them is the larger-than-life format, with 190 to 125 centimeters in each case, and the narrow image detail, which reproduces only the facial field, without hairline and only with indicated neckline in front of the neutral black background. The actual face in light shades of brown is covered by a two-dimensional mask in a dominant cyan blue, whose outline is marked by a bright white line and some interior lines on the inside. Here, both planes, the face and the mask, enter into an intense symbiosis. Shadow tones framing the eyes and the light brown toned contours of the face shape convey a certain special depth. In contrast, the light areas of the mask, especially around the nose and mouth, model these zones in terms of volume. This effect is supported by the softening effects of the white tones in the right facial area. To the second point, about form and content and their effect on us. Relevant for the strong effect on us is the larger-than-life reproduction of the portrait photos. Compared to ourselves, they appear exaggerated into the monumental. This impression is reinforced by the six-fold variation of two mirror image portraits arranged inverted. In formal terms, the restriction on the motive to the sharply contoured face also contributes to this. The reduced use of color, concentrating on the contrast of blue and white and a few shades of brown and black, creates a pronounced surface effect that leaves us little room for distance, parallel to the extremely reduced physicality. The familiarity of the motive in contrast to its striking variation triggers a certain uncertainty. This effect is intensified by the difficulty of recognizing the person behind the mask. The decision alone as to whether it is a male or female person does not succeed unambitiously. The person appears strangely androgynous. In summary, the impulses of the composition given by formal means pursue a strategy of overtaxing and overwhelming. But who or what is imposing itself on us here? Titles and clues from the context concretize the directional values of the composition. On the one hand, it is Katharina Sieverding herself who served as a motive here. On the other, her life companion, Klaus Mettig. The photos or the series is based on an overlap of both. Here, in figure 3, we see a previous version in which the motif were still superimposed in a slide projection. Finally, with the title itself, Transformer, the direction of interpretation becomes clear. It culminates in the question, who am I? Female? Male? The switching back and forth between the sexes, the ambiguity, thus becomes the theme. In the end, it falls back on us, the viewers. Who am I really? In relation to myself, this raises the question of who I actually am behind my different roles as a woman, as a researcher, as a wife, and as a mother. Continuing, for this I change back to the first portrait, inverted portrait. Continuing, it is now necessary to consider the context of the work more closely, specifically on the influence of art. The question of influence arises all the more against the background of the compositional borrowings from pop art, especially from Andy Warhol and his sometimes larger-than-life, strikingly colorful portraits, which, however, leave no doubt as to their effect, stylizing the sitter into an icon or star. Actresses like Marilyn Monroe, but also the rich and beautiful, are thus exaggerated into role models, successful stars of the business world and the glamour scene. Who the characters ever really are as individuals and what makes them special remains open. They virtually hide, as Sieverding illustrates it, behind a mask of a beautiful illusion. It is precisely this phenomenon that Katharina Sieverding is concerned with, following in the footsteps of her teacher Joseph Beuys at the Düsseldorf Academy of Art, making people themselves the subject of her work. Beuys condensed this concern in the concept of the so-called social plastic. In Transformer, Sieverding asks precisely these questions about the meaning and power of role models into which people slip. In concrete terms, then, this series is about the roles of women and men and the respective attributions that are questions with the concept of indecision. To this day, they provoke ultimately all of us to the counter question, who am I really? Finally, a brief conclusion. Images as agents of cultural transformation processes. The concept and method of vitality semiotics is based precisely on making the vital affective formal aspects fruitful not only for the understanding of images, but beyond that, for the communicatively affective questions to us inherent in them. Besides the formal aesthetically affective sensations and the historically relevant meaning of images, the communicative decision-making and action-relevant aspects of images come to the fore. Their respective significance in our lives become important, which is weighed differently depending on the gender and social cultural background of the viewer. As impulses for one's own life, images can lead, mostly not directly, but indirectly, to decisions and actions. In this way, images can also be understood as agents of cultural transformation processes. Yes, thank you very much for your attention.